Hi, this is Mike with Actifio here for part 3 in our multi-part series on Microsoft SQL Server, backups, recoveries, copy data management. In parts number 1 and 2, we covered backups and restores in some detail, talked about a lot of considerations, different approaches, pros and cons, performance impacts. If you haven't watched those, I highly recommend you do, as we're building on that base knowledge for this particular part of the series. This part of the series is all about using your copy data, using those copies you make with your backup application or snapshots, whichever method you chose, for purposes beyond restores. So when it comes to beyond restore, there's really 3 different things that people tend to do. Number 1, they use their copies for disaster recovery. Number 2, they use it for test data management. Number 3, they use it for some other production-like purpose, such as reporting or analytics. Now, when it comes to using your copy data for any of these, performance really matters, and performance is probably the number 1 consideration that's out there. And if you think about it, right now, today, whatever method you're using, you've got some backups of your data. If you wanted to, you can simply do traditional restores, where your backup software is going to restore your data all the way back to your SQL Server in order to enable any of these particular use cases. You can do restores for disaster recovery, restores to enable test data management, restores to enable reporting and analytics off of a copy of the data. I'm guessing that's not of much interest to you, because if it was, you wouldn't be watching this video right now. So you already know the impact of that approach. That really leaves mounts. And when it comes to mounts, there's a couple of different considerations. Number 1, is your copy data on your production storage array? And if it is, are you doing mounts from that production storage array? And when you do, you have a couple of really strong benefits. Number 1, you have production-like performance, right? It's your production storage array, production class of disk, presenting to your SQL Server. You've got that production performance. But at the same time, you've got a much higher level of risk. Because if you think about it, most people don't run their test databases on their production storage array side by side with their production data. And the reason for that's very straightforward. If something goes wrong with your test environment, you don't ever want it to impact your production environment. And by goes wrong, sometimes that is a performance impact. Sometimes that is a capacity issue. Sometimes it's just a matter of change control. You don't want to be doing snapshot type activities, maybe reprovisioning on your production storage array during production hours, but yet for test and development, you really need to sometimes do those activities during production hours. So great performance, somewhat higher risk. Can be mitigated depending on the storage array and the users, but that's always there. And then finally, you have the fact that using your storage array tends to be a very storage-centric approach. If you're using your storage array for snapshots, as we've talked about in the past, that also probably means that your storage layout is corresponding to your disk layout. It probably means that you have a storage administrator involved in all of those types of activities, not necessarily a very usable or self-service type approach. On the other hand, if you have your data in your backup infrastructure, and your backup infrastructure supports doing mounts, well then, instead of actually copying the data to your target server, it's simply presenting the data to your target server. Now you have a completely different set of considerations. From a performance standpoint, the duration is very, very fast, just like it is with the snapshots. Your performance of the actual IOs, that is now very variable. Some of the considerations we've talked about in the past: what is the tier of disk that you have your data stored on? Is it deduplicated or not? What is the backup application? Is it storing it in its own native format and then emulating out to here, and therefore doing a translation layer as those IOs take place? And if it is doing that, what are your performance requirements? If you're doing functional testing in your test and dev environment, well, that's probably not got a very high level of performance required. On the other hand, if you're talking about a QA environment or a staging environment, those oftentimes have to mirror production performance. So that now becomes very relevant. You also want to consider concurrency of the environment. Can your backup infrastructure support dozens or hundreds of concurrent mounts of backup data into a variety of different environments for you to use. So all considerations to be looked at, questions to ask when you're considering what you want to do here. The other side of this is the usability side. So from a DR standpoint, and everything I've said so far for performance, by the way, equally applies to disaster recovery, test and development, analytics, and reporting. From a usability standpoint, though, now you're looking at oftentimes multiple products, right? For disaster recovery, you're looking at a DR orchestration tool. For reporting and analytics, maybe it's something as simple as a scheduling tool that's going to schedule doing, hopefully not a traditional restore, but maybe, but scheduling doing your mount operations from wherever you're doing them from. For test and development, now things get a lot more interesting because now you oftentimes want self-service so that your users can go and create their own databases, and maybe it's actually from one source feeding into all three of these, and then refreshing on different schedules. This one needs to be refreshed to a different point in time when this user particularly wants it to. So now having the ability to do self-service really can be a game changer from an efficiency standpoint. Having your test and dev users say, I need something, and be able to get it without waiting for a backup administrator and a storage administrator and a server administrator, that can be very impactful to your development life cycle. You also want to make sure from a test and development standpoint that those scheduled refreshes can take place, that you can say, I've got a database here. I don't always want to provision a new one. Sometimes I just want to refresh it. And also, sometimes I want to back it up. Sometimes I need to have backups of my test environments. And not only backups of my test environments, but sometimes I need to branch off of them to create multiple test environments. And each one of these might need their own backups. And with each of these backups, you might say, hey, as a developer, I'm about to run a test that's going to be fairly destructive to the data in my copy. So I'm going to take a snapshot of it first. I'm going to take a backup, insert a bookmark, whatever terminology you like to use. I'm going to run my test. It might corrupt my data, or it might just make a bunch of changes that I want to roll back, but I don't always want to refresh it back from the source or back from the original source. So usability in self-service isn't just, can I get the database? Can I handle all of the things with it that I want to do with it? Can I create these grandchildren and branch and then pick a point in time and roll it back to that point in time all myself, right? So those are the usability types of things that come up. And then finally, you've got multi-tenancy. In order to be self-service and efficient, especially and primarily in the test development space, you also need security. Can you handle things like data masking? Can you handle making sure that this development group can't see the databases that are being used by this development group, which can't see the databases from this development group? So that's kind of a summary of your considerations when it comes to using your copy data management. Are you using it from your backup infrastructure? Are you using it from your primary storage? A little bit of pros and cons of each. Thanks for listening.